Welcome to Reflections, the podcast that biblically encourages, equips, and empowers women for apostolic life and service. Here's your host, Dr. Cindy Miller.
You know, in March, we talked about decluttering our homes, decluttering our lives, getting organized, and we had so much fun being walked through. We were coached and encouraged in how to get this all done. And it really sounds appealing. And if you didn't listen to it, I hope you'll go back and listen to that episode. But if you are like me and a few other 100,000, I don't know, however many women who are listening, who are like us, even though all that sounds appealing, it's easy to get overwhelmed, easily be overwhelmed by our belongings and our responsibilities. And you know, the truth of the matter is most people have more stuff than they have space for. And that doesn't help an already troublesome problem. So what do you do when the way you are living and working is no longer working for you? Well, I want to welcome you to this episode of Let's Talk. And with us today, we're so excited to have someone that I admire immensely, love dearly, Dr. Esmeralda Delgadillo. And she is just so precious. You're going to love getting to know her, but she's an ordained United Pentecostal Church. She is a licensed professional counselor, and she is the CEO, president, and clinical director of the Apostolic Center for Counseling. So, Esmeralda, thank you for joining us today. I'm so happy that you made time. I'd love for you just to kind of greet our audience and introduce yourself. Talk a little bit about this journey to the Esmeralda you are today.
Dr. Miller, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I am so excited. I am a professional counselor here in Houston, Texas, in Kingwood. I'm in private practice. I started off being a pastoral counselor many years ago. Before that, I was a principal for 16 years of a private school in our local church. And what I discovered was that as much as I loved being a principal, I enjoyed even more sitting with students, holding space for them, praying with them, counseling with them, and their parents. So then I decided that I wanted to become a professional counselor. We were assistant pastors at the time. So for 16 years, we were doing that. And then the Lord called us into the pastorship. So my husband and I pastor here in Kingwood, Texas, also Family Fire United Pentecostal Church. And so simultaneously, as we're pastoring, I opened up my private practice there in Kingwood. And it has been such a blessing. There's, I think, besides ministry in our local church, there's nothing that I enjoy more than sitting with people that are hurting and bringing them to this place in this journey of therapy. And that's my approach to therapy is it's a journey. I always tell people I don't come into the counseling room just telling people what to do. Well, I think a lot of people go to therapy and want answers, but I enjoy the journey because I find that most people really do have what it takes to make that journey or to make better decisions. And then how much more for those of us that are filled with the Holy Ghost and that seek the wisdom of God, you know, in those places. So I've been in private practice for about 7 years now. I have 2 wonderful children. They're now adults. I have a 26-year-old.
That's always amazing when you think about, like, how did that happen?
It is. My 26-year-old just recently got married, so now I have a daughter-in-law, and then I have an 18-year-old daughter who is in a pre-med program, and she's going to be graduating next year. So it's exciting. There's a lot of things going on. I'm also the president and CEO of the Center for Apostolic Counseling. I'm very excited about that. Our goal is to have a therapist, a licensed clinician in every state. Right now, we have about 100 across the United States and in Canada. So we're very
excited. It's such a great resource. You know, well, first of all, I'm so blessed because, you know, I'm ashamed to admit the lazy side of me, but also I want the very best. It's just a text. Like, who is my go-to? Esmeralda, send a text. Like, help me out. Who do I refer to on this? You're just so great. But the center, I remember, I don't know if you remember this, but at General Conference one year before, it was in the dream stage. Do you remember coming in? We kind of had this brainstorm sit down chat at General Conference, you know?
Yes.
And then
it's
to
been a while.
see, Yeah, that was quite a while ago, and then to see the work you and your team have just engaged in to bring it to the level, and the
Absolutely.
link to that will be in our notes section, but yes, I'm so thankful that you are the visionary behind that.
Well, Sister Marion Peets is the original founder, and she is such an amazing woman of God. And then Brother Chad Parker, so we're the founding board
Yes.
members. But
Mhm.
it is just amazing to see what God is doing, and I'm just so blessed to see the people of God, our movement, pastors that are being very supportive and open to therapy. We're removing the stigma and just allowing people to get the help that they need because we already know that the Lord has done the work.
Yes, it's the
It's
Lord.
not Jesus and therapy, it's Jesus. It's all about
Yes.
Jesus. And we just come alongside the journey to walk with the people of God, which is so scriptural to bearing one another's burdens
Yeah, the
and so
body of
fulfill the law of
Christ doing
Christ.
what we're supposed to be doing.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about what made you decide to go get that doctorate.
Well, I felt like I had reached a certain level of, I think, knowledge, but I realized that there was such a great need in the body of Christ. So my specialty is addiction and compulsive behavior. So, those are areas that people aren't comfortable talking about. And
You're
in
right.
my area or my wheelhouse, my sweet spot is working with couples that have been through marital rupture, infidelity, where one spouse may have, sexual addiction, sexual impulsivity, or intimacy disorders. And again, those are things that people don't like to talk about, and both in male and female. And so I felt like this is something that we need to talk about. The church needs healing. Those are things that cannot be swept under the rug because God desires for us to redeem those parts of ourselves, specifically with sexuality. And so
Absolutely.
I felt like, you know what, it's time. And now it's more prevalent and it's more talked about and we're more open about it. So I'm excited about that. And it has been a blessing. I'm sure that you can relate to this, but once I did attain my doctorate's degree, you find out that you really don't know anything.
Exactly. I know a whole lot about one little bitty area, and there's so much more. No, it's just amazing. It's such an incredible journey to do this work educationally. It's not easy, and I applaud you. You were doing all the things we've just talked about: pastor's
Right.
wife, minister, speaking at conferences, the counseling practice, and getting the Apostolic Counseling Center up and running and, endorsed by the UPC, all these, and you're in the middle of all of that, still with family life, you
Right.
take on this journey, but it is such a commitment. And I like what you said. I'm finding this as well. Even 25 years ago, counseling wasn't as accepted as it is now.
Right.
But I think that pastors appreciate having the partnership of resources, that relief. I don't have to know it all, be it all. I don't have to be the entire body of Christ all by myself.
Right.
There's people that can do this work, but we live in a hurting world, don't we? Oh my goodness.
Absolutely. And so we need to be a support, and the collaborations I think bring strength to the body of Christ because the Lord is
Absolutely.
going to come back, and he wants a bride without spot and blemish. How do we get there? We get there by being transparent. We get there by living an authentic life. And that means dealing with the things that cause us to weigh us down. The Bible says to lay aside every weight and sin that does so easily beset you. So I believe that that can be done through the therapeutic process.
I agree. And we're gonna kind of get into more of that. I want to really address a topic today. Like I said, when we started last month, we had such a great time talking about, I mean, I was so inspired, how to get my home organized, my workspace organized, um, this decluttering process, all that. It was just so great. But then as I was thinking about it, I really started thinking about my own struggles, some women that are around me that I love and admire, their struggles that, they're saying, you know what? I work 40 hours a week. I'm a professional. And you and I can relate to what these women are saying to us, I work 40, and then I come home from my second shift, and I'm sure there's some women who have great partners, but there's some single moms, and there's some women that maybe their husband isn't in the home in the evening, or they just have different allocation of roles. Everybody lives a different kind of life, but they're saying, I have children, or I have parents I'm caring for, or I'm chauffeuring, I'm caregiving.
Right.
It's just all I can do to get dinner together. And then we add to women's work week, second shift at home. We have church. We have
Right.
ministries, maybe teaching Sunday school or music practice or praise team practice or, Bible club or quizzing or, church is our life
The
for
list
many
goes
of it.
on.
Yeah, goes on. So women say then to me, that my circle and maybe yours, they say, I would love to declutter. I would love to get organized. I would love to have this focus, but I just don't have time. So that's
Right.
one thing they say. The other thing that I've really noticed, we blame time, but people are just overwhelmed by stuff. That office space that has now become the storage area, and you just kind of trip your way into it to get a little work done. And just not even knowing how. So here's my question. Do women ever come into counseling with you for the purpose, they're just saying, you know what? I'm so overwhelmed by my life that I don't even know, I can't even manage my life anymore. Does that ever happen?
Absolutely. And there are several reasons why that does happen. First of all, I think when a person asks themselves that question or they're really feeling the pressure of that, I definitely want to acknowledge that because I think you have to have a measure of self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost when a person gets to that point, they've reached their capacity for either minimizing it, repressing it. And so if there is someone who's going, I just don't have time, I feel overwhelmed, I think we have to pause and listen to that because we're so good as women for bypassing that. So I think the first step is you being able to reflect and say, I'm feeling something here. And so if we can pause, then we can start taking steps into doing something about it. Because if not, it's this cycle. I call it the dance. You just get right back into the dance, the cycle of minimizing, or,
Mm-hmm.
you get into the cycle of bypassing things or inactivity. So we have to be able to have that measure of self-awareness. And that can be happening for several reasons. It could be happening because it's a trauma response. It could be happening because there's a lack of boundaries. It could be happening because there's depression and anxiety. It could be happening because there's ADHD, right?
Mm.
Which is very common, but it's very difficult to recognize that because as women, again, we don't pause. We're nurturers. We tend to look at everybody else. We want to hold space for everybody else. We want to make sure that everybody else is taken care of. So as women, we tend to find it very difficult to focus on ourselves. It's difficult focusing on everything else, but it's that much harder to focus on ourselves. So if there is a woman who comes to this place of that self-awareness, I think you have to give yourself a little bit of credit. And I'm going to start with that because even going into the direction of acknowledging, ADHD or depression and anxiety, there's a lot of shame and guilt that are attached to that.
And unawareness.
Absolutely. Because
Like if
again,
if I came in to see you and you said, "Well, I
right,
think we should test for ADHD," I'd be like, "Yeah, yeah, I don't think that's the problem," because
right.
who even talks about that?
Especially in women, because ADHD in women and men look very different. So when you think about ADHD, you're picturing a little boy, hanging from the chandeliers and
Right.
running around in circles and screaming his head off, or somebody who is extremely talkative and loud. So you're looking for that hyperactivity component. But
Mhm.
in women, it doesn't look that way. So instead of there being an external symptom of hyperactivity, it's internal. It's internal. And so have you ever heard someone say the thoughts, they just don't stop? My brain, it just doesn't stop. Or I'm having lots of ruminating thoughts, or I have all of these things to do. So the hyperactivity is internal with the
Mhm.
thoughts or the emotions. And so when you look around, you might see a person who doesn't have the motivation. So you have the hyperactivity, but then you have the hypoactivity component, which is a person who completely shuts down. So you have to ask yourself, what does that look like in a woman? I don't have the motivation. I have all of these tasks, I have all of these projects that I have the desire to complete, but I just don't have the motivation. And so as therapists, it can quickly be diagnosed, or, psychologists, psychiatrists, as depression. Right? This looks like depression. And so if we're not careful to look at all of the components, someone can be misdiagnosed. Another thing that can happen is that it can be misconstrued as being lazy. This person is lazy.
Right, right. For some reason, we would go there instead of looking at, real causes, like, oh, they're just lazy. I don't know.
Right.
It's
And
sad.
because there is a lot of shame and guilt that's tied with a person who might have these internal symptoms going on, these ruminating thoughts or a loss of motivation. And so what I try to tell people is, especially when they say, I feel guilty, I always tell them guilt is something that you intentionally do. Okay, so you know that you're not supposed to do it and you do it anyway. Then there's that piece, that lets you know that's guilt. If you know that you're not doing this intentionally, there may not be the motivation or the strength or the energy to do that. I try to remove that from the vernacular. Let's take that out. That's not, guilt, because guilt is a very strong emotion that brings a lot of indictment. And when there's that kind of indictment, then we're so ashamed that we're not going to go to a therapist. We're so ashamed that we're not going to go and ask for help. So what do? We try to take that upon ourselves. And it brings more of a rut, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Help me understand, one thing that you talked about is this motivation. Is that the same thing as someone lacking motivation because they're depressed, or is that two separate?
Well, first of all, let's go to what, something like ADHD brings, which is a neurodevelopmental issue with the executive functioning of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus. So when ADHD is present, it means that there are not enough neurochemicals getting to the brain. So remember, the executive functioning of the brain is what controls mood. It does control the impulses. It controls our hormones. So if you don't have enough of that neurochemistry going on, you're not going to have the motivation. So it's not like, well, I just don't want to do it because I don't feel like it. This is a neurobiological situation going on. Okay, so that's the first thing we have to understand, that those kinds of situations, ADHD, that kind of diagnosis is not something that is purely driven by my desire to do something. It is clinical, it is organic. So a lot of times the motivation is not there because of the deficiency of the neurotransmitters in the brain. So we cannot, go to someone and say, well, all you have to do is convince yourself to do it. All you have to do is make the decision. All you have to do is think differently. It doesn't work that way.
If they could do that, they wouldn't be sitting in your office.
Exactly, exactly. Now, with that being said, we also know that trauma affects the executive functioning. We know that genetics affects the executive functioning. So there are many, many components that we have to take into consideration. So when a person has the level of awareness that you and I were talking about earlier, being able to pause and say, where is this really coming from? Is this something that I have struggled with for many years? Because we might believe that it's situational. It's because, I'm going through this in my marriage, or, oh, it's because I'm menopausal, or it's
Which
because of
does
this.
play a role,
It
absolutely.
plays a big role. And it's actually more visible in the menopausal state, of whether or not a person has, the diagnosis of AD, because of the deficiency of the neurochemistry that happens. So it's more pronounced. So again, I think as women, we have to be able to pause, and focus on ourselves for just a minute. And that takes time. And I hope that somebody that's listening to this today will understand that it's not being selfish, that it's not being irresponsible to pause and say, I need to consider my mental health. I need to consider my emotional health. I need to consider my spiritual health, my physical health. If I know that I'm feeling overwhelmed, or I'm not meeting the goals that I have for life, or the visions that I set for myself. Because again, going back to the shame and guilt, it can really cause a woman to isolate because
Or
she's
further,
comparing
and
herself.
you just shut down even more.
Exactly.
So if I were to come in and you suspected ADHD was kind of the root, what would be the first steps I would need to take? Is that something that's done in your office, or do you send out for testing? I mean, how do you really
Absolutely.
get down to knowing what we
Well,
should do here?
the first thing that I would do is, as a therapist, is I check to see if there's a history of trauma. Because again, there can be co-occurring disorders. So someone can have ADHD, have PTSD, and all of those things. That's why it is important if a person is coming to a place where they're not functioning anymore. They're unable to function. Things are getting out of hand. We're looking at hoarding, or we're looking at not being able to access certain things in the house. It's getting out of hand. So what do? You say, this isn't something that I can navigate on my own. And so people are sometimes apprehensive about going to therapy because what are they going to say? What are people going to think about me? What is my therapist going to think about me if she knows that my bedroom looks like a tornado went through there, and it happens like that weekly? So when you come in, the first thing I do is try to do a check to see if there is any trauma there. If a person comes in and says, I have just this constant barrage of thoughts, my brain doesn't stop, I feel exhausted, I really can't focus, I start things and I can't finish them, I want to sleep more often than not, and there's these coexisting pieces there, then what I'll say is, why don't we send you over to get you some testing, to do some ADHD testing? Because I am not going to diagnose. I'm a
Right.
licensed professional counselor, but I'm not going to diagnose. 9 times out of 10, when I send them out, the diagnosis is right, though. And what I will often do is sit down with the DSM and go over some of the criteria. So, and what I tell people is, don't be afraid of the diagnosis. It does not define you. And so I do want to say that just because you get a diagnosis doesn't mean that defines you. What it does for me as a clinician is help me to know what approach to use in the therapeutic journey. So I do believe that it gives us a direction on some of the techniques and tools that we can use, on the therapeutic journey. So when
And
someone
just that
goes in,
understanding of
that's
yourself
it.
to say, okay, there is a real situation going on. I'm not just lazy or making it up or having a bad
And that can
attitude.
be so affirming for a person who goes, wow, that explains so much, that I'm not. And sometimes they, believe that there's something worse going on when they go, really, that's what I had? That's what my son has, or, hey, that's what my parents had, So again, it's just bringing some enlightenment. And then we have a template for where we're going to go with this. And depending on what's going on with the situation, again, because there could be co-occurring disorders. When there's ADHD and it hasn't been addressed or hasn't been properly diagnosed, then it can bring anxiety and depression. Why? Because I don't understand what's going on with me. I'm unable to focus long enough to be able to bring about these tasks or to meet my goals, or even in relationship, right? Because of the shame and guilt, it makes it very difficult to communicate needs because I don't want the stigma. I don't want to be labeled as that. Okay, so when the diagnosis is there, then what it allows that person to experience is a sense of empowerment, in such of using it as an excuse. Of course not. But now I am going to get tools. And I have had several situations, probably in the last month, where I've sat with ladies who go, what's so great is that my husband thought I was lazy, or that I was just being difficult. And it wasn't that. It really takes a lot for me to focus. Here's another piece. When we think about ADHD in women, we often think these are the people that are disorganized, right? They're the ones that aren't going to want to categorize, or things to be just right. But it's quite the antithesis of that. Sometimes when it takes so much to focus and so much energy, we have a person who becomes a perfectionist. Because if anyone sees my deficiencies, then they're going to know what's going on with me. So it's quite the opposite. They work even harder so that no one sees the chaos that's happening internally.
And that's an exhausting way to live.
It's a very exhausting way to live. And what we find is these women tend to be very successful in their careers. They're very successful in their ministries, But when they get home behind closed doors, it's like, okay. So we see the chaos erupt at home in their private world.
So the people closest to them see it and are most impacted.
Exactly. Exactly. So again, it looks very different between men and women, but some of those symptoms are, of course, the inattention. And that's because I have such a difficult time
Excuse me.
focusing. I have such a difficult time organizing myself. I'll start off, I've had, some tell me I'll start off understanding a task, but when I start looking at the task, I try so hard to focus that I end up veering off into something completely different. Okay, so that's the inattention there. And then, of course, we have the hyperactivity, which in women, I'm going to reiterate this again, is not being hyper talking all over the place. It's the internal hyperactivity, the ruminating
And I think
thoughts.
that's so good to know because we do, when you say ADHD, we do tend to think of that hyperactive person. And then when you are not, you're like, okay, well, that's not me at all. But
Right.
yet your brain is hyperactive.
And
It's
I
on
think that is the
overdrive.
most common element that I see with women. The most common nuance is the internal rumination and the thoughts that are just coming. And you might see this emerge with people who have lots of sticky notes who have to remind themselves. And they may not even realize that they have ADHD. But
Well,
why
I
is it
think
that
I'm
I
going to
have
go and get tested. If you could see all my sticky notes and my three different planners trying to keep me organized, either that or I'm just
because as
overloaded.
we learn how to manage, but
Absolutely.
that
We don't have
doesn't
a
mean
choice.
we
It's
don't
not a
have a
choice for
choice.
us.
But it doesn't
Mm.
mean that it leaves us in an emotionally regulated place. In fact, it's quite the opposite. There's that emotional dysregulation, right? Where I have to work at being able to calm myself. So again, you can see where it can be commonly diagnosed as anxiety. So we
Mhm.
have to look at the bigger picture here.
And then we have, we have this struggle too. And women talk about where is the peace of God? Like I just want to rest in his presence. How do you rest in the presence of the Lord when your brain never stops?
Right. And so that's a very good point there, because one of the things that I do encourage my clients with, and as a therapist, the approach that I take is called bottom up. I don't work from the top bottom, because I think we're quick to say, well, if you just control your thoughts, then you can control everything else. If it were that easy, people would do it. But it's not that easy. So again, it could be that the body, the nervous system is dysregulated for various reasons. And so even with some of my clients that do have ADHD, I work from the bottom up, which means I want them to start regulating their nervous system first, because many times the body is so dysregulated that we don't even understand cognitively why we're feeling the way that we are.
So
So,
what are some of the exercises that you would have a client do to regulate?
grounding techniques using the five senses that God gave us. So, what I'll tell them is if there's a situation where they're really feeling dysregulated in their body, I'll have them go get a bowl of ice, a big bowl of ice, throw some water in there, and dunk their face in there for 3 to 5 seconds. And you come out, and what that does is it resets your nervous system,
I
those
love
kinds of
it.
things.
Love
Yeah,
it. I
airheads,
know
I think.
I know people are listening going, you got to be kidding me, but it's
Cold
amazing.
plunges. That's
Yeah.
exactly right. And so, the deep breathing. Sometimes I'll have them throw a warhead or an airhead in their mouth. Why? Because all of the, contracting and releasing and trying to, bite on a sour candy actually helps to release the tension in the body. And so we don't know how to do that because many times we don't understand what's happening. But if you ever look at someone that has ADHD, you're going to see their knees moving, you're going to see them fidgeting everywhere. That is a dysregulated nervous system. So if we can work from the bottom up, trying to regulate that, then we have our nervous system at a sympathetic state or a parasympathetic state, because if we're at what we call a sympathetic state, you're always in the fight or flight mode.
Hmm.
And someone can be stuck in that mode again because the neurochemistry is off or because of trauma. and we live there. The problem is it's not sustainable. And so when a person walks into their home and they, again, they have intrusive thoughts or they have ruminating thoughts, they can't focus, they walk into a room and there's chaos everywhere. Their nervous system is right there at this fight or flight. I know I got to do this. I know I got to do this. When you're at that state for so long, because it's not sustainable, we eventually fall into a collapse. And that collapse is a numbing state, a frozen state.
Mm-hmm.
And then we talk about that, not having the motivation. It's not really the motivation. You don't have the energy. Your nervous system is so overworked that it becomes overwhelming. So it's not lazy. It's not that you don't have the motivation. Your nervous system doesn't even have the space to do that. You don't have the
It's
energy to do
total inability right at this point.
Exactly. And it even causes illness because, again, God did not create us to be in that state. The nervous system is the indicator. It lets us know that something is off. And that's what I say about emotions also, because when you have ADHD, the emotional regulation is so off. And so when people begin to feel strong emotions, they bypass them, they suppress them, they become perfectionists, they become avoiders, inattentive. Instead of using the emotion as an indicator, it becomes an indictor.
That's good.
Okay, so when we
Good to
can
know.
look, and that's what I speak with about to my clients is instead of running away from the emotion, this is overwhelming. I'm never going to get anything done, so I feel ashamed. Instead of using it to indict you, acknowledge the emotion. Why am I feeling shame? What am I telling myself about myself? If I tell myself I don't have time, I don't have time, what's the emotion behind that? The emotion behind the phrase I don't have time is I feel so bad. I feel less than, I feel incapable, I feel worthless. Okay, let's take that. And because I'm feeling this emotion, now I have the core belief. So now I'm getting into the little therapy here, but I have
No,
the
we want to
core
hear it.
belief. And the core belief tells us where the cognitive distortion is. And so if I say to myself, I feel worthless, why? Is that my truth? Of course not. So then I have to consider if I can't focus, is it because I'm worthless? No, that may feel like your truth, but it's not. So if I know that I can't focus and it's not because I'm worthless, it's not because I don't have a desire, then I have to acknowledge there may be something else going.
Well, this is all so good. So we're getting these helps and insights and understanding, but we're going to address that one thing that people really don't like to talk about. So when we are lacking, and it's just that it's so hard to pull yourself up and do this work yourself. There's therapy and there's medicine and there's the combination of medicine and therapy. What is your stand on, we know you're for therapy. How do you feel about medication and ADHD in women?
I believe that if medicine is necessary, then it should be available. And I don't think there should be any shame or indictment about it. Because again, with ADHD, it is a neurodevelopmental issue. So we're talking about brain health here. And I've said this before, we would never indict someone for having to take insulin. We would never indict someone for having to take hormone therapy replacement. So why would we indict someone for having to take medicine that can provide the neurochemistry necessary to regulate and help us focus?
So who would make that decision? So as a therapist, you send someone out, it does come back. Yes, they have ADHD. You see that they're really struggling. Who would make the decision and prescribe medication?
A
Who does that?
psychiatrist. A
So when you
psychiatrist.
refer out, you're referring to a psychiatrist.
Absolutely. And so what
Because
I tell, go
Because
ahead.
I'm concerned when I hear women, and this is why I'm bringing it up, because I'll
Sure.
hear women say, "Oh, I talked to my doctor and he just wrote this script for me." And I'm like, this is me on the inside. I'm not telling people how to live their lives, but I'm like, there's no diagnosis, there's no
Right.
test. It's just word of mouth. You said, I think, and you're getting a script. It seems pretty easy to get scripts anymore, but
It
it's a little
is. And
concerning.
sometimes what will happen is that the PCP will diagnose someone with anxiety or depression, we'll give them very low dosages. And I
Mm-hmm.
find that there are a lot of people who are more comfortable with their PCP than a psychiatrist. But what I tell people is psychiatrists are trained in this area. They understand the brain as an organ, and they're trained, and they're able to look to be able to diagnose and assess whether or not they're co-occurring disorders. So they're going to be
And
able
we
to
have
prescribe.
some excellent apostolic psychiatrists that are even on your website.
Yes, I'm very excited about that because we have someone, and with Dr. Torres, I love her approach because she says it's not always straight to medicine. I want to make sure that that is what's necessary in the moment. So, again, I think we need to be able to, help people to understand that the brain is an organ, that there really is a neurochemical component here that is real. And so I don't always send someone to the psychiatrist. But again, going back to if someone isn't able to function at a level anymore where it's really becoming dangerous, and when a woman falls into that place of, inactivity or the hyperactivity with the ruminating thoughts where it's just like I don't want to get out of bed, or I'm finding myself responsive in a way that is harmful to my family, or it's affecting my relationship, those kinds of things, then obviously I'm going to refer them to the psychiatrist and they can get help with the medicine. But medicine by itself doesn't work. We want
No.
medicine and therapy together that bring the best
Yes.
results.
And not really anticipate, oh, I'm just going to put a band-aid on this and a quick fix. You want life changes. I mean, our goal, especially in this care and counseling field, is changes over a period of time that are sustainable. Not
Right.
always like, let me just put a band-aid on it until that band-aid needs to be replaced. So no one wants that approach, to be going on. I'm so sad we're almost running out of time, but let me just bring this up. In the women that you work with, I know you've mentioned before about the importance of a support system. Can you talk a little bit about a support system and who would be involved in that and what they would be doing?
Absolutely. I'm going to give you an example. What I find is with many women who have ADHD, or, they feel like they have tried for many years to get on a routine. These are the ones that start, January 1st, I have this method, I have this approach, and then they end up, falling short of their own goals. The shame and guilt is so much that they would never ask anybody for help. But what
Mm-hmm.
I find is if you have a friend that you trust, just an example here, if you have a friend that you can trust that can come and help you get organized, maybe every other month, especially if that self-awareness. I know that, after about 2 months, I'm going to fall off the bandwagon here, and there's going to be some moments where I'm not going to stay as organized. Finding a friend that you trust to say, hey girl, I do struggle with staying focused, and it would be great. I'll take you to lunch later on. Maybe we can make a girls' day,
I
or
like it.
just
Yeah.
someone that you trust to say, I do have a difficult time focusing. I started this, but if you can help me, I would greatly appreciate that, because sometimes that's all we need is somebody to come and walk with us. I'm not talking about letting them take over or anything, or even an accountability partner. Personally, I have a lot of things on my plate. I love it when I have friends that come and say, hey, I know that you had this, and this going, that you were going to start writing a book, right? And this
Let's don't
person,
talk about that, Esmeralda. Let's don't.
I'm, because it's easy to get distracted, and then it's easy to feel the shame of not producing. But I
Mm-hmm.
love it when a person goes, and they don't come at me with, hey, have you done this yet? But it sounds like this. Have you had some time for yourself? I know that you had said that you wanted to get away for a couple of days to write that book. Have you done that? Is it on your calendar? What can I do to help? What a blessing, because then all of a sudden I have someone that understands the difficulty that it is for me. I have someone who sees me. And I really do believe that a support system also, outside of the accountability, shows that I genuinely care about you. And with women, we need that. We're so busy pouring out into others, nurturing others, that one of the approaches and tasks, or very practical ways to be able to accomplish or stay focused, is making time for yourself. I had a client that said, after a couple of sessions, she realized, I think this is something that I do have. She didn't need to go get medicine. She didn't need to be referred out. She said, what I did was I got up about 2.5 hours before everybody else. She said, because I knew once everybody else gets up, that's it. That's when my brain starts going. I can't focus. She said, but what I found is if I can wake up 2 hours earlier and take my time, I'm not rushing. I don't feel any external pressure. I don't feel, that I have all of these tasks to meet. What I did was I started looking at myself and said, what do I need? And that has been so beneficial for her because she said the anxiety started to go down because she realized she had done everything that she needed to do, that she needed time for early before anybody else was awake. And I thought
I
that's
really
wonderful.
like that. That is so wise. Because once people get up, then you're paying attention to them. You can't really pay attention to yourself. It reminds me, there's a book out. I think it's called More Than Pretty Boxes. The author's Carrie Lane. It's a huge research study, so only nerds really want to read it. But it's a lot of research study that was done on professional organizers and why the rise of professional
Right.
organizing. But one of the things that the research showed was it wasn't so much that people needed someone to come in and clean their office out or their living room or whatever dining room, is they needed the support. They needed that
Yes.
person to come in and help them think through, do
Yes.
the task, think through the task, hold them accountable to the task, but just being present to keep them focused. And that's kind of what you're saying here. I mean, you could hire someone to do it, but if you have a friend who's willing to do it for lunch, and in
Right.
exchange for lunch, and just because, that's their gifting and that's their strength and they can share that. I love the idea of having that person that just comes in every few
Yes.
months and works
Yes,
with
and
you.
a person that you feel comfortable with. And again, I think it's that transparency and vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
And not, hating on yourself or indicting yourself or shaming yourself, but saying, this is just something that I struggle with. And taking off the facade, because again, as
Mm-hmm.
women, if you're having an ADHD diagnosis, then it can be shameful. And we've got to remove that because, again, it could be trauma, it could be genetics. There's so many different components that are going on at one time, but having that self-awareness.
And educating people around us, like, hey, I think this is going on, and so
Right.
you understand me better, because we teach people how to treat us. And so if we don't communicate to them, this is my struggle,
Right.
then they may be thinking, thoughts that shouldn't even be there. And
Right.
there's an unnecessary frustration, because it does impact relationships when you have, whether it's chaos in your mind and clutter in your life or whatever, it impacts, who's responsible for this mess and who's going to fix
Right.
it, blame gets started.
Yeah, and even then, I've had situations where both husband and wife have ADHD. So
Well,
that's a whole
that's
other topic there. But that's why I go back to, one of the tips, that I can drop today is, if there is a person listening that feels like they might have ADHD, first of all, and you want an official diagnosis, you can go to your therapist, go to a psychiatrist to get diagnosed without fear, without
Mhm.
indictment, but give yourself some time. I think when we can give ourselves that allotted time to not feel the pressure, in the moment, if you are feeling the pressure and your thoughts begin to, kind of wander, going back to saying, I can take this one step at a time. You've heard the phrase, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, one piece at a time.
Right.
How do you take this down? I know that, if I can accomplish this, celebrate that instead of indicting yourself like, why I still have all of this done? No, I accomplished this one task at a time, writing those things down one task at a time, one project at a time. Don't take on multiple ones and make it yours.
One small project at a time,
Right. Right. And
one
make it
winnable,
yours. Yes.
winnable project at a time.
Make it yours, because if you do it for everybody else, therein lies all of the pressure. I mean, I know we
Mhm.
have responsibilities, but especially in our own homes, make it yours. This is mine. This is what I want to accomplish, and I'm going to be compassionate and empathetic on myself. I think that self-empathy, self-compassion is something that as Christians we stay away from. For
Mhm.
some reason, it's like, no, I'm going to love everybody else. I agree. We have to love and have compassion and empathy for everyone else, but we also have to have it for ourselves.
Absolutely. Because if we're tearing ourselves down, I mean, we're made in the image of God. We're his
Right.
creation. We're his beloved child. And
Right.
then we're just hating on ourselves, and that just a no-win situation immediately. And I don't
Absolutely.
think God is pleased with us for doing that. He wants us to enjoy life. He wants us to feel his grace and his mercy and his love and value of us. And we can't do that when we're being mean to ourselves and speaking hatefully to ourselves.
No, that's a wonderful point.
So we come to this. There's some things that we did not get to, and I'm so sad. This is such an amazing conversation, and I've loved every minute of it. But if there was one thing I didn't allow you to talk about because I overtalked or you just ran out of time, but what is any last words to our listeners today that you'd like to leave with them?
I just want to encourage anyone that is listening that God is actively working in your life. And so, with Christians, I think sometimes as Christians, we feel like if we have to look at anything else or go anywhere else for help, going to a therapist, going to a psychiatrist, maybe, again, getting a support system, we feel like we're not spiritual. We feel like we're letting God down. And I've heard that over and over again. Maybe I don't pray enough. Maybe I don't have enough faith. And I always tell them, spiritually speaking, if they're committed to God and they say, I even have spiritual disciplines that I try, but because I can't focus, I fell.
Right,
So there goes the
right.
shame and indictment. But I always
Mm-hmm.
tell them, as a parent, I love my children ferociously. And there are times when they, are going to do things that are going to disappoint me, but my love for them is stable. My love for them is always there. I dream for them. I want to support them in all things. How much more our Heavenly Father, who is completely aware and sovereign of everything that happens with us. So if you find yourself in a place where you're needing to reach out for help, talk to someone, get a support system, remember that God is sovereign and he ordains everything that happens in our lives. He is over the journey, and he's going to use every piece of the story, every part of the narrative is precious to God. So I want to encourage someone today that if you are having a hard time focusing, if you are having a hard time, with that hyperactivity and, internalization that's happened, look for help, talk to somebody. I want to encourage someone today that it's okay to have therapy. It's okay to go to the doctor, because so many times we're apprehensive about it because of the shame that we feel for, we feel like we're letting God down. We feel like we're letting our pastors down, our leadership, our parents. And so there's a lot of fear. But the best thing that you can do to be a blessing to your family is get help.
Amen. Well, I want to go back to one of the most powerful statements you've made today. Well, they were all powerful, but something that I think we need to be reminded of, and that is to our listeners, if anything that was said today was hitting home with you, then do what she said and hit that pause button. You have to
Yes.
stop, because you can't just say, oh, that was good, and then just keep racing past it.
No.
Really do hit the pause button and say, God, you put me and this podcast together
Right.
for a reason, and help me to engage with this in a way that, there are healings that occur, and sometimes they're about having an issue here with my podcast. There are things that occur in our life, and we say, God, heal my brain, and he will. But sometimes he takes us on a journey, he's like,
Absolutely.
I'm going to heal your brain by X, Y, and Z. That's how it's going to get healed. So great, great. So happy to have you with us today, my sweet friend
Thank you.
Esmeralda.
Thank you.
Every listener, so thankful that you join us. Please do share this podcast with your friends. Let people know that Let's Talk is out there and available, and it is for the women of the UPCI apostolic listeners. There will be notes in the notes section. So as Dr. Delgadillo has recommended some books or some reading, and we'll put it in the notes section. And next month, we're going to have a great time. We're going to be talking about postpartum in women, and not just for the new moms, but also for the women who love them and want to help them and be better support. So until next time, God bless you. Take care, and we will see you again.